Officers thought no one would notice. Then a single video destroyed their story. The neighborhood lay quiet beneath the steady glow of the afternoon sun. Light spilled across rows of identical houses, glinting off windows and shimmering against car hoods parked neatly in driveways. The air was warm, carrying the faint hum of lawnmowers from somewhere down the street, mingling with the soft whir of sprinklers clicking in rhythmic cycles. Children's laughter drifted over the fences as they raced their bicycles, the metallic clatter of wheels and playful shouts weaving into the tapestry of suburban calm. Everything felt ordinary, as though the world itself had settled into a comfortable rhythm. On one corner, behind a white picket fence that had seen its share of careful repainting, a man stood among his flowers. His name was Daniel. A black man in his 40s, he moved with the quiet assurance of someone who knew the value of patience and persistence. His figure was tall but not imposing, his shoulders squared beneath a navy blue polo shirt that bore the faint marks of sun and work. A neatly trimmed beard framed his thoughtful face, and his short fade haircut caught the sunlight whenever he leaned down to inspect a bloom. Daniel held a garden hose in gloved hands, water arcing gently onto the soil. Drops sparkled as they caught the light, feeding rows of marigolds, petunias, and roses that lined the walkway. Each plant seemed placed with intention, as though the garden itself told a story, one of care, resilience, and quiet pride. He didn't water them hurriedly. He moved slowly, almost ceremonially, giving each flower its turn, pausing now and then to pinch off a wilted leaf or brush away a stray insect. His expression softened as he worked, and for anyone passing by, the sight might have seemed almost meditative. To Daniel, this garden was more than decoration. It was a piece of his history stitched into the soil. He had planted it after moving here years ago, determined to make his house into a home, a sanctuary where his family's dignity could take root. Every flower bed, every patch of green, carried his quiet defiance against those who had once suggested he keep things simple or stick to grass like everyone else. No, this was his space, his mark on the world, and he had nurtured it with a devotion that could not be mistaken. The neighborhood around him went about its day. A woman in jogging clothes passed by, earbuds in, barely noticing him. Across the street, an elderly couple sat on their porch swing, the man sipping lemonade while the woman flipped through a magazine. From time to time, their eyes drifted toward Daniel's yard, but not unkindly more with the idle curiosity of neighbors who measured the day in small observations. Daniel remained focused, his movements steady and unbothered. The gentle spray of water hissed softly, settling into the soil and darkening it with new life. His gaze lingered on the roses, their petals unfurling in the sunlight, delicate but unyielding. A faint smile touched his lips. For him this was peace, a moment of stillness, of belonging. He didn't yet notice the quiet rumble of an engine rolling slowly down the street, or the pair of eyes studying him from behind tinted glass. The steady rhythm of Daniel's afternoon slowed when he caught sight of movement at the far end of the street. A white SUV crept along the curb, its glossy paint reflecting the sun with an almost sterile brilliance. On the driver's side door, stamped neatly in blue and gold, was the insignia of the Homeowners Association. It wasn't unusual to see their vehicles patrolling now and then, yet something about the way this one moved deliberate, unhurried. Tinted windows concealing whoever sat inside felt different. Daniel's hand paused on the hose for a moment, the arc of water breaking apart and drizzling onto the grass. He brushed the thought aside. It was only an inspection, he told himself. Nothing to worry about. He had paid his dues, kept his property clean, and followed every guideline as best as he could. With a small shake of his head, he returned his focus to the roses, crouching slightly to check the soil's moisture. But the SUV didn't pass. It slowed, then came to a stop right in front of his driveway. The engine gave a low, restless growl before falling silent. Daniel's eyes narrowed. His chest tightened, though he couldn't quite explain why. The doors opened in sync, and out stepped two men in crisp uniforms. Their matching navy jackets bore the HOA crest on the breast pocket, polished badges glinting beneath the sunlight. They moved with rigid precision, like actors rehearsing a role they knew too well. Daniel straightened, tugging his gloves off one finger at a time. He expected a nod, a greeting, something neighborly to soften their arrival. Instead, their faces held no warmth. One man, taller, with close-cropped hair and a jaw set like stone, scanned Daniel's yard as though it were evidence in a crime. Seen. The other followed his gaze, his lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. Finally, the taller officer raised a hand and gestured toward the flowers along the walkway. "Those," he muttered flatly, his tone carrying no hint of conversation. "They look out of compliance." For a beat, Daniel blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. Then a laugh bubbled up, light and almost apologetic. "Out of compliance?" he repeated, as if saying the words aloud might unravel their absurdity. He gestured toward the blooms, radiant and neatly trimmed. "These are just flowers. I've had them for years. Surely there must be some mistake." Neither man smiled. Their silence pressed down like an invisible weight, stretching into the warm afternoon air. The taller officer's eyes didn't leave the roses, his gaze sharp as if cataloging every petal. The second officer crossed his arms, his stare fixed on Daniel himself, cold and unwavering. The laughter on Daniel's lips faltered. He cleared his throat, shifting his stance, but the unease had already crept in. The sound of distant children playing now felt muffled, as though the world had retreated, leaving only the oppressive stillness. Between him and the two men, what had begun as a peaceful afternoon in his garden now carried a tension he could not ignore. And though he tried to steady his breath, Daniel could feel it, the first ripple of trouble stirring quietly beneath the surface. The silence fractured when the officers moved. Without another word to Daniel, they began circling his yard like predators surveying territory. Clipboards appeared in their hands, pens scratching quickly as though every blade of grass, every flower, every patch of soil was being catalogued for evidence. One officer crouched near the roses, tilting his head and jotting notes, while the other stepped back several paces to snap photographs with a sleek black phone. The shutter clicks felt loud against the quiet of the neighborhood. Each snap was deliberate, sharp, echoing in Daniel's chest as if documenting not just flowers, but his very existence. The two men leaned toward each other at intervals, whispering in clipped tones. Their words were too soft to catch, but the rhythm of their exchange was unmistakable. Accusation dressed as procedure. Daniel set the hose down carefully, water dribbling into the soil. He straightened his shoulders, his voice even, though frustration tugged at its edges. "Excuse me," he began, forcing calm into his tone. "I think there's some misunderstanding. One submitted my garden plans weeks ago. Got approval from the board, in writing." He gestured toward the walkway, as though the flowers themselves could testify. "Everything here is within guidelines. I double-checked before planting." Neither officer acknowledged him. One continued scribbling. Other crouched low to snap another picture. Daniel felt heat rise beneath his collar, not from the sun, but from the deliberate indifference with which they treated his words. He took a breath, grounding himself in patience that felt thinner by the second. Finally, the taller officer rose, his expression carved from stone. He closed the distance between them, boots crunching softly against the gravel. "Identification," he said abruptly, his voice a command, not a request. Daniel blinked. "I'm standing in my own yard," he replied slowly, disbelief lacing his words. "Why do you need my ID?" The officer's jaw flexed. His partner had already lifted a radio from his belt, pressing a button. Static cracked the air before he spoke into it, low and official, requesting additional units. Possible non-compliance, resident refusing to cooperate. The words hit Daniel like a blow. Non-compliance, refusing to cooperate. He hadn't raised. His voice hadn't taken a step toward them, hadn't done anything but water his flowers. Yet the language painted him as a problem, a threat. From the corner of his eye, Daniel noticed movement. Curtains shifted in nearby houses, neighbors, peeking through narrow slits of fabric. Across the street, an elderly man who had been sipping lemonade earlier now stood frozen on his porch, glass dangling in his hand. A young mother pulled her child a little closer as they stepped inside, shutting the door quietly. Others lingered. At thresholds, uneasy shadows watching, but no one spoke. Their silence wrapped around him, heavy and suffocating, as if the entire block had become a stage where everyone preferred to remain an audience rather than intervene. Daniel's pulse quickened. He forced his hands to remain visible, steady at his sides, though his instincts screamed at the injustice unfolding. He thought of the letter tucked neatly in a drawer inside his house, the stamped approval from the very HOA board these men claimed to represent. Proof existed, but proof alone rarely protected against power wielded carelessly. The officers whispered again, scribbling, circling, capturing him and his flowers from every angle. The calm of the afternoon had curdled into something sharp, brittle, and dangerous. Daniel felt it now, the escalation, the shifting of ground beneath his feet. What began as quiet pride in his garden had turned into a trial without warning. And the verdict, it seemed, was already being written against him. The low hum of the radio had barely faded when the wail of sirens broke the air. Daniel's head snapped toward the corner just as a second patrol car swung into the street, its red and blue lights flaring violently against the calm afternoon. The beams washed over his garden, splashing his flowers in hues of warning, as though the yard itself had been turned into a crime scene. Neighbors who had been peeking through curtains now stepped onto porches, their curiosity pried open by the flashing lights. The children's laughter that had colored the air moments earlier faltered into silence. Bicycles abandoned on sidewalks as little faces stared wide-eyed. Even the birds seemed to scatter, their wings cutting sharp lines through the sky. New arrival pulled up alongside the HOA SUV, its tires grinding against the curb. A uniformed officer stepped out with purpose, his expression already grim, as if he had been briefed on a danger that never existed. Refusing to comply, one officer announced, his voice louder now, designed to be heard by every ear in the vicinity. He gestured toward Daniel as though presenting evidence. Trespassing on HOA property. The words rang absurd, surreal. Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He blinked, momentarily stunned into stillness. Trespassing? His voice cracked with disbelief. This is my yard, my house, my land. How can I trespass on what's mine? He took a step back toward the garden gate, his hands raised in a gesture of openness, palms out. I have the approval. I did everything by the book. You can't just, but his words tumbled into the void of their indifference. The taller officer closed the distance swiftly, his shadow falling across Daniel like a final judgment. With a sudden practiced motion, he seized Daniel's arm. The shock of the grip jolted through him. Wait, please. Daniel's voice shook now, rising in both pitch and desperation. I'm not resisting. This is my home. Another officer circled behind him, the space closing in with suffocating speed. Rough hands clamped onto his other arm, yanking it back. Pain flared through his shoulder as his body was twisted, his balance stolen from him. Daniel struggled to keep his voice steady, his words pouring out in fractured gasps. You can't do this. You don't have the right. This is my property. His pleas evaporated against their stony silence. One of them reached for the cuffs at his belt, the metal glinting cruelly in the sunlight. A moment later came the sound, the sharp, final click of cold steel locking around his wrists. The sound carried through the street like a gunshot. Children froze in place. Conversations that had begun in hushed tones among neighbors died instantly. Even the air seemed to pause, thick and heavy, as though the entire neighborhood had been forced to bear witness. Daniel stood shackled, his chest heaving, his face a portrait of disbelief and humiliation. His knees trembled beneath him, not from weakness but from the sheer weight of injustice pressing down. He searched the faces around him, desperate for recognition, for someone to say what he already knew, that this was wrong. But the crowd remained still, their silence louder than any shout. The officers exchanged no glances, offered no explanations. To them, this was routine, a box checked, an order carried out. To Daniel, it was the moment his dignity was bound in chains. Right there in the yard he had cultivated with his own hands. The metallic cuffs bit into his skin as they tightened. And with that, the peace of the afternoon was gone, shattered by the sound of power misused. The clink of the handcuffs still echoed when the officers began steering Daniel toward the patrol car. His steps were unsteady, not from resistance but from shock, the weight of humiliation bearing down heavier than the grip on his arms. His eyes flicked desperately to the crowd, neighbors on porches, faces half hidden behind curtains, silent witnesses to his unraveling dignity. The stillness of their quiet carved into him deeper than the cuffs. Then, cutting through that suffocating silence, a voice rang out, clear, shaky, but defiant. "I have everything on camera." The words cracked the air like lightning. Heads turned. The officers froze mid-step. From across the street, a teenager stepped forward. His frame was thin, almost wiry, a high schooler with nervous eyes but a steady grip on the phone he held aloft. His fingers trembled against the device, but his voice carried stronger than his body betrayed. "I recorded the whole thing," he said, louder now, forcing strength into his tone. "From when you pulled up to when you cuffed him." Daniel stopped breathing for a moment, staring at the boy as if seeing light cut through storm clouds. The officers stiffened, their expressions tightening, but the teen didn't waver. With a few quick taps, he turned the screen outward for everyone to see. The neighborhood leaned-in curtains were pushed aside fully. Neighbors stepped off porches. Even the elderly couple crossed their lawn to join the growing circle. The video played. Its sound crisp against the hush. There was Daniel, hose in hand, watering his flowers in the golden light of the afternoon, his movements calm, deliberate. The footage showed the SUV rolling to a stop, the officers emerging with cold expressions. It captured Daniel's polite confusion, his laugh when he thought it was a simple misunderstanding. Then came the silence, the way the officers ignored him, circling, photographing, whispering. The footage picked up his calm explanation about the HOA approval. His voice was steady but edged with frustration, a man trying to reason with authority that refused to listen. And then, unmistakably, the escalation, the demand for ID, the unnecessary radio call for backup, the accusation of non-compliance and trespassing. Each word documented, undeniable. Finally, the arrest itself, Daniel's protest, his trembling voice insisting, "This is my home," drowned beneath the cold efficiency of hands forcing his arms behind his back. The crowd gasped collectively. Some covered their mouths. Others exchanged sharp glances, the truth settling heavily in their chests. What they had seen in fragments from porches and windows now lay whole before them. The abuse of power, the fabrication of a crime where none existed. The teen's voice cut in again, steadier now, fueled by the ripple of outrage in the crowd. He didn't resist. He didn't refuse. He was just watering his flowers. For a moment, no one spoke. The officers shifted uneasily, the authority that had seemed unshackable now cracked by a glowing screen in a teenager's hands. Daniel stood frozen, wrists bound, but something flickered in his chest, hope, fragile but undeniable. For the first time since the SUV had stopped at his driveway, He wasn't alone. And in the stunned silence of the neighborhood, the balance of power shifted, if only by inches. The video still hung in the air like smoke after a fire, its images looping in the minds of everyone present. Neighbors whispered in low tones, exchanging looks that carried both disbelief and dawning outrage. The officers stood stiff, their authority fraying beneath the weight of undeniable evidence. And then, through the murmurs, a new voice rose clear, sharp, unshaken. "I'm on the HOA board," the woman said, stepping forward from the crowd. The shift was immediate. All eyes turned toward her. She was in her mid-50s, her gray-streaked hair pulled neatly into a bun, her frame steady with the confidence of someone used to being heard. She had been there all along, silent, her lips pressed tightly as if weighing whether to speak. Now her gaze cut through the officers like glass, and I never saw any complaint filed against him. The words dropped heavy, slicing through the scene. Gasps rippled across the crowd. Daniel's chest tightened, his breath catching as he stared at her. For a fleeting second, the handcuffs around his wrists felt even heavier than lighter, as though her words had pried at their grip. Taller officer's jaw shifted, his face blanching. "Ma'am, that's—" But she didn't let him finish. "Don't you dare lie," she snapped, her voice rising with conviction. "I sit in those meetings. I read every report. There has never been a single complaint about Daniel's yard, his flowers, or anything else." A hush swept across the street, deeper than before. The unspoken truth began to crystallize. This wasn't about compliance, or flowers, or paperwork. This was something darker, something personal. The whispers spread like fire catching dry leaves. If there was no complaint, why are they here? Why bring backup? Why accuse him of trespassing on his own land? Faces turned, some toward Daniel with sympathy, others toward the officers with suspicion. A young mother clutched her child closer, shaking her head in disgust. The elderly man who had watched silently from his porch now muttered under his breath, "This isn't right. It never was." Daniel felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief at being vindicated, fury at the revelation, and the hollow ache of knowing that his humiliation had been no accident. His voice, low but steady, broke through the murmurs. "So this wasn't official? You weren't sent here by the board?" Neither officer answered. Their silence, once a weapon, now betrayed them. The taller one shifted his stance, the other clenched his jaw, but their refusal to speak said more than any denial could. The woman's voice carried again, firm as iron. "You acted on your own. You targeted him without approval, without authority. You used this neighborhood's rules as a weapon." The crowd buzzed louder, the truth settling in. This was never about marigolds or roses. This was about control, about power, about prejudice dressed up in the language of regulations. Daniel stood straighter despite the cuffs, his eyes locked on the men who had tried to break him under the guise of order. Around him, the community no longer felt like passive witnesses, but a gathering storm, their silence giving way to anger. And for the first time since the SUV had rolled down his street, the officers seemed small. The street, once muted by fear, now buzzed with a rising current of energy. Phones lifted one by one, neighbors angling their cameras toward the officers like a line of mirrors reflecting the truth. Every gesture, every twitch of muscle, every hesitation was captured. The authority that had seemed so unshakable only minutes earlier now looked brittle, fragile under the gaze of dozens of unblinking lenses. The officers froze, their rigid postures betraying the first crack in their armor. The taller one glanced toward the other, as if searching for a script, a way out, but none existed. Their silence, once heavy and commanding, had become damning. Even the patrol car's lights, still flashing red and blue against Daniel's flowers, seemed absurdly theatrical now, a performance without an audience willing to believe. Daniel stood between them, Wrists bound, his chest rising and falling in measured breaths. The cuffs cut into his skin, but his eyes no longer carried fear. They burned instead with a quiet defiance, fueled by the shifting tide around him. He could feel it, the collective will of his neighbors tilting, no longer spectators but witnesses, ready to speak. Finally, under the weight of cameras and whispers, the shorter officer moved. He pulled the key from his belt, fumbling slightly as though his fingers betrayed his unease. Without meeting Daniel's eyes, he slipped the key into the lock. The mechanism gave a sharp click, the sound reverberating down the street like a verdict overturned. The cuffs fell away. Daniel flexed his wrist slowly, the red marks stark against his skin. For a long moment, he simply stood there, reclaiming the air around him, reclaiming the ground beneath his feet. The taller officer muttered something about a miscommunication, his voice tight and hollow. The words sounded flimsy, dissolving as soon as they left his mouth. The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps turned to voices, voices to outrage. Miscommunication? A man barked from his porch. "We all saw what you did. You tried to ruin him." Another shouted, anger cutting sharp through the air. Murmurs of shame threaded through the anger too. Neighbors realizing aloud that they had stood frozen, watching, when they could have spoken sooner. "I should have said something," a woman whispered, guilt heavy in her tone. "We all should have." The teenager with the phone stepped closer, raising his voice so it carried. "This wasn't a mistake. You knew what you were doing. If I hadn't filmed." His words faltered, but the weight of them hung unchallenged. The officers shifted uneasily, their hands resting near their belts, though no one threatened them. Their power had drained away, not through force, but through exposure. Daniel finally spoke, his voice steady though rough from strain. "You tried to take my dignity, but it wasn't yours to take." The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in affirmation. For the first time, voices blended not in whispers, but in unity, filling the street with the sound of collective conscience. Anger, guilt, relief, they all collided into one undeniable truth. Injustice had been caught, stripped of its disguise. The two officers stood at the center of it all, shrinking beneath the glare of phones and the weight of a community that had awakened. And Daniel, standing tall with wrists free, felt the tide shift back to him, the turning point sealed not by force, but by truth. That evening, the quiet neighborhood found itself at the center of a storm. The video, less than 3 minutes long, spread faster than wildfire. By nightfall, it was on community forums, local news sites, and social media feeds. The image of Daniel standing in his own yard, wrists in handcuffs while two officers barked false accusations, ignited outrage. The footage of the teenager's trembling hands capturing the truth became a rallying cry. Comments poured in. This man was on his own property. How many times has this happened without a camera? Accountability now. The officers' names were spoken aloud, their faces frozen in screenshots and replayed in endless loops. Their muttered excuse of miscommunication was dissected, ridiculed, condemned. That night, under the weight of public fury, the department announced an investigation. The HOA board, suddenly exposed to scrutiny, called an emergency meeting, its polished veneer of authority cracking under the light of unwanted attention. Inside Daniel's home, the air was heavy. He sat at his kitchen table, the faint scent of the day's flowers still clinging to his shirt. His wrists bore red marks where the cuffs had cut into him. He traced them with his fingertips, each line a reminder of how close he had come to losing more than just dignity. Shaken, yes, but unbroken, he glanced out the window. The patrol cars were gone. The flashing lights no longer painted his home. Instead, his yard looked as it always had, alive, cared for, his pride woven into every bloom. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the street, soft and golden, as though determined to restore what the night had tried to tarnish. Daniel stepped outside with his watering can. The flowers, thirsty from the previous day's chaos, seemed to lift their heads toward him in quiet solidarity. At first, he expected silence. The same silence that had once made him feel isolated, watched but unsupported. But today was different. As he moved along the edge of his garden, he heard a voice. "Morning, Daniel." He looked up, startled. A neighbor stood by the sidewalk, not just watching but smiling, tentative yet genuine. Then another voice called, "Your roses look beautiful." Another followed, "We're glad you're okay." One by one, they came not as a mob of spectators, but as people seeking to make amends, to acknowledge what they had witnessed and failed to stop. Some offered handshakes, others simple nods of respect. The teenager who had filmed the ordeal walked up too, phone in his pocket now, his eyes filled with something more than fear, pride. Daniel's throat tightened, but he managed a small smile. He didn't need their pity nor their guilt. What he needed, what he had always needed, was recognition of his humanity, his right to live and breathe in his own home without fear of it being taken from him. The flowers swayed in the breeze, as if bowing in quiet approval. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt the neighborhood shift, fragile but real. His dignity had not been erased. It had been defended, first by his own refusal to bend, and then by truth, carried on. The shoulders of a trembling voice and a lens that refused to look away. And so, he watered his garden, his roots deep, his spirit unbroken. In the quiet after the storm, the neighborhood carried a different weight. The flowers in Daniel's yard stood tall, their colors vibrant against the afternoon sun. But it wasn't just the garden that had survived. Something deeper had taken root, an awareness that could no longer be ignored. Injustice often wears polished disguises. It hides behind uniforms pressed crisp and clean, behind clipboards filled with official language, behind insignias meant to represent order. To the untrained eye, it can appear as authority, as rules meant for the greater good. But Daniel had lived through the truth. Those symbols can become weapons when wielded without conscience. It had taken courage, a trembling teenager's camera, a single woman's voice of defiance, and the quiet endurance of a man who refused to let his dignity be erased, to strip away the disguise and reveal what lay beneath: prejudice, intimidation, and raw misuse of power. That afternoon had been about more than flowers or compliance. It had been about belonging. Daniel's home was not just bricks and paint. It was the soil where his hands had planted hope, the porch where he had sat through long summer evenings, the walls that had heard his laughter and his prayers. His home carried his story, his history, woven into every detail. To have that threatened under the false pretense of authority was an assault not only on his property, but on his very identity. And yet, the truth had not been silenced. The moment the teenager stepped forward, holding up his phone with shaking hands, was the moment fear cracked. That single act of bravery, born not from strength, but from conviction, shifted the tide. It reminded everyone present that courage does not always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it comes in whispers, in shaky breaths, in the decision to record instead of turn away. Then came the woman's voice, sharp as glass. "I'm on the HOA board, and I never saw any complaint against him." Her words shattered the last illusion of legitimacy. The silence of the neighbors, once heavy with complicity, became unbearable. In that moment, silence revealed its cost. Because silence enables oppression. It allows lies to grow roots, allows injustice to repeat itself unchecked. But when voices joined, when cameras rolled, when truth refused to be hidden, silence lost its power. What happened in front of Daniel's home would ripple far beyond his street. The video had already traveled into countless homes, sparking conversations that many had long avoided. Parents showed it to their children as a lesson, activists used it as fuel, and neighbors carried it as a mirror to their own hesitation. The lesson was clear. Home is sacred. It is more than property lines drawn on paper. It is dignity, belonging, and history, something no false authority has the right to strip away. And when that dignity is threatened, it takes more than one man's resistance to preserve it. It takes collective courage. As Daniel stood in his yard the following morning, watering his flowers once again, he felt the shift around him. Greetings replaced stares, respect replaced suspicion. And while scars remained, so did a reminder. Courage, even when quiet, can turn the tide. Injustice thrives in shadows. But the moment light shines on it, through a camera, a voice, or a stand, it begins to wither.